Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. Today, we're going to talk about a little known Jewish resistance escape project that the person we're interviewing spent many years researching. So, let me tell you who he is. Leora Geller is the director, writer, and producer of the new feature film, The World Will Tremble. We're recording this March 13th. It's going to actually open in theaters, U.S. theaters tomorrow. It's the first film to uncut, and March 28th in the UK and elsewhere. It's the first film to uncover the true story of the first escape from a Nazi death camp. The escape provided the first eyewitness of the Holocaust, and having just watched it, what's fascinating is that the BBC radio actually broadcast the smuggled out information on June 26, 1942. So you realize how soon into the war that was. And the most other interesting thing I thought was that the movie starts on January 19th, 1942, the day before the Wannsee Conference. So, Leo, tell us first how you found out this little known history.
Yes, thank you, Phyllis. Thanks for having me, and thank you for your show and everything you're doing to commemorate the remembrance of the show and of the Holocaust. I came across this story about 11, 12 years ago now when I started researching my own family's history in the Holocaust. My last Holocaust survivor relative had just passed away, and no one really ever knew her story, and that kind of set me on this course of Holocaust research, I would say. And in that research, I came across a story of Chelmno, spelled Chelmno, also known as Kulmhof in German. That was the
Yeah.
German name they gave it. I was somewhat familiar with Chelmno as a Nazi death camp. I wasn't aware it was the very first. I was familiar with the gas vans, the gas trucks. Many people are not familiar with that. I had seen those images, but I definitely was not familiar with the story of Solomon Wiener and Michael Podchlebnik and the fact that they were the first two Jews to escape a Nazi death camp and provide the first eyewitness testimony of the horrors of the Holocaust. And I thought that was an incredible piece of information, an incredible story that most people were not really familiar with. And that's when I started researching it more. Then it became not so much about my family's history, but about this particular story. And when I first had the thought of perhaps adapting it to film, I looked for first of all, I searched for films because I was sure that it had been done before, and in fact it hasn't. I only actually learned this later that we're our film is the first to even portray Chelmno, let alone a feature film, documentary, TV, otherwise. And then I looked for a book to adapt as a screenwriter, because I had done that before. I had adapted books and novels, and I couldn't find any. I couldn't find a single book dedicated to the escape of Solomon and Michael, even an academic book. So I realized then that this would have to be done through archival research to piece together the bits of information that exist, that were out there about Chelmno and about Solomon Wiener and Michael Podchlebnik.
So, one of the things, I don't know if I can reach behind me and get this, that I'm very interested in is telling people about the fact that when the Nazis uh, entered Poland on September 1st, 1939, Poland was really divided in three parts.
Mhm.
And one part, as you wrote in the beginning of the thing, was annexed. It became part of the Third Reich,
Right,
literally.
right.
The middle was governed by the Nazis, called the central government. And in the beginning, the Russians had the eastern. So
Mhm.
in this map that I study, I discovered that Chelmno was actually in the annex part.
Correct.
And that was the part that the Nazis were very determined very early on to push the Jews and everyone else they could, such as Poles and everyone else, out so that ethnic Germans could settle in that region. So,
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, a lot of people have this image of Poland as being occupied, which it was, obviously. Warsaw, other big cities, Krakow, where Auschwitz was, of course, and many other of the camps. But this particular region where Chelmno was constructed was annexed by Germany, and that was one of the first places where they started, as you say, expelling or getting rid of the German population, and they started settling.
And the Jewish population.
Yeah, sorry, the Jewish population, and they started settling ethnic Germans in those regions. There were, in fact, Germans living there in those villages at the time of where my film takes place in January 1942. And for example, so somebody made a note to me after one of the screenings, a Holocaust researcher, that the yellow stars were not accurate because they had the word Jude on it, as we've seen in many other films. And actually, I pointed out, no, that's not true. In this particular region, the part that was annexed, this particular region around Chelmno and Lodz, that's how the stars were. And then they looked into it and they said, "Oh, you're correct. That's how it was." Because we put a great amount of work into researching uh, every element that we could to make sure that that it's as historically accurate as possible. I'm saying we because I did it in the writing process, but then once we started developing the film and we started going into pre-production, so everyone on the team, the particulars of the costumes and the stars, of course, was done by my costume designer Irina Kocheva and her assistant Gabi. They did a tremendous job of researching, doing their own research, making sure that everything is period accurate.
So I knew that about you, which is why I'm going to ask you this question.
Mhm.
Because I know I've gotten those kinds of notes on my nonfiction Holocaust plan and stuff, and I have on my website. Yes, not every tattoo was at Auschwitz. No, you know what I'm saying? But okay.
Yes.
So why did some people, and I think I know the answer, but I'll let you answer it, have the yellow star in front and some in the back?
You had to have it either in the front or in the back. That was really the rule. Sometimes they would enforce both front and back, but in general, in that time in the ghettos, they had
Right.
to put it.
In that time, we always have
Yeah,
to say, in that
right.
time, go ahead.
Yeah, that particular time, again, this is the beginning of the war, in a sense. I mean, now looking back, to them it wasn't, right? They had been living
Right.
a war for about 2 years, right?
Yes.
The ghettos, especially there, were there for a very long time. Chelmno was, still is a small village, Chelmno nad Nerem. There's a few Chelmnos in Poland today, actually. Sometimes people confuse it with Chelm, as is well known.
Uh-huh.
Chelm is actually a much bigger town. But Chelmno nad Nerem, Chelmno on the Ner River, that's where the camp was structured, and that's where it's the monument still is, and the museum is still there. So it was a small village. There was a few thousand people, and they had ghettos in almost every town and village in the region, and the only towns that were Jewish that didn't have a ghetto was the ones that were too small, and they just took the Jews out of that village and put them in a slightly bigger one. So we had villages like Kolo, Bugaj, Izbica, these different villages around that region with Lodz, right?
Yeah. No, but we're going to say Lodge on this show. I
We're
had
going
an
to say
earlier
Lodz, right,
podcast.
right,
We
right.
explained,
I tried to use the Polish pronunciation as much as I can in the film, but yeah, so Lodz, that's how people know it. That's how it's pronounced in Hebrew as well. Being the biggest city, right, in the region and the largest of the
yeah,
ghettos in that region. But Chelmno was a ghetto. All these other small towns and villages had their own ghettos, like Grabov, which we see in the film, right, the nearby village where the characters escape to or plan to escape to. That was a village that was not yet liquidated, right, in January of 42, and all that was real. So we started talking about that was the situation at that time. And like you're saying, I like that you say that it's important to know, when this story takes place, because I think that's one of the unique aspects of this particular story.
yes. And that's why I always make a point whenever I can that you must look at the exact time, the expectation, so that you understand there's nothing like a monolithic. So that's why I knew there'd be an answer about the front and back. So let's just quickly uh, repeat. So this, according to my notes that I just took a watch, January 19th is only about 6 weeks after Chelmno opened.
That's correct. So it was constructed in the fall, but it started being operational on December 8th, 1941. That was the first day when the first transports started arriving. In
Oh,
fact,
so
the first ones were from Kolo. In some places, you might see December 7th as a date, but it officially started receiving transports on December 8th. It was opened as the first death camp, almost as a prototype to for the Nazis to experiment on mass murder.
Okay.
And the first commandant was Herbert Lange, who was previously a commander of the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen were the killing squads that were attached to the Wehrmacht. As the Wehrmacht, the regular troops would
Right.
drive east, so the Einsatzgruppen would follow them. And Lange was previously a commander of one of the most deadly of the Einsatzgruppen groups, and that's why he was handpicked to lead Chelmno.
And I think we should say here that you do have in your film one sentence, but people should realize it, that even the German soldiers started to have a really hard time, not all of them, and this face-to-face killing. And that was partly why the Nazis decided, okay, so how can we now not make them face-to-face? And so Chemna was an experiment. And now you want to describe how the experiment worked in terms of the gas.
Yes, that's right. I added that little scene of David Cross, a brilliant German actor who plays Commandant Lange. Um, I added that little beat where he kind of tells this little anecdote of a German high-ranking officer who had fallen asleep in his garage with the engine of his car on. And then he woke up and he realized how deadly carbon monoxide from an internal combustion engine could be, right? I mean, now it's kind of obvious to us, but I guess back then it wasn't so much. And he had the first idea to experiment with exhaust fumes. And they had first constructed around in the fall of 41, 42.
41.
They had constructed a truck made by Opel. It was an Opel Blitz, I think, the first one. Opel, the car manufacturer. They had taken a regular delivery truck and fixed it up, renovated it, retrofitted it so that the back bed would be completely sealed on the inside, and a hose was connected from the exhaust fumes into the back bed of the truck, and the doors would seal shut and would be closed with a padlock. So they first created that truck for the Einsatzgruppen, and that truck was used a few times. And then they knew that that is what they would utilize at Chelmno. And at Chelmno, they first used those first trucks that they were using, and then they had maybe two or three at any given time, made by Opel and another car manufacturer. That's how they realized they would be able to murder more people more efficiently. On any given day at Chelmno, at least at this stage in the beginning, they would receive about 10, 12, sometimes less truckloads of Jews from the nearby villages. They would first arrive at the courtyard of the villa. Now, Chelmno, it's important to say, it wasn't a camp like most camps as we think of today. It didn't
Right.
have large barracks or buildings.
Right.
It wasn't a concentration camp. It wasn't a prison camp. The only Jewish prisoners that were there were specifically held to help the Germans operate the camp. So you had a number of Jews held in the castle, the Schloss Jews, the castle Jews. Then you had a number of Jews, slightly larger number, in the forest, which was just a little ways away from the villa. And those Jews, their responsibility was opening the gas trucks, unloading the bodies, putting them in ditches that were previously dug, mass graves, and burying the bodies. And those Jews had to basically dispose of roughly 800, 1,000, 1,200 bodies a day, right? Because if you had 10 to 12 trucks, about 80 to 90 sometimes people in each truck, that was the amount of people that they would kill. So after the Jews would arrive in the transport trucks into the courtyard of the villa, usually the commander, sometimes it was one of the officers, would come out and give this speech to the Jews, telling them that they know how hard the war has been for them, how hard life is in the ghetto, but now their troubles are over and they have all been chosen for work, and they're about to be transported to a factory in Leipzig where they would be given wages and food and whatever. And in fact, we know that uh, a, a lot of the Jews who heard these speeches were very relieved to hear this, and they believed every word of it. Right, that they even clapped sometimes. We hear this in Michael Podkremnik's post-war testimony, and they were so relieved at the words of this commander. And then the commander would say, that there's typhus going around, and we have to be very cautious. So please mark your belongings, mark your valuables. They would even give them letters to write to their families that they had arrived in Leipzig and everything is okay, and those letters were then sent. And once they would enter the villa, there were two rooms where they would undress and prepare for a shower to be disinfected. And that would go on for a little bit. The rooms were even warmed by an oven because it was very cold, obviously, right? January in Poland. Once they undressed, they weren't fully naked, but once they undressed in undergarments, they went through the cellar and up the back with signs that said to the bathhouse. I show that even in the film, zum Bathhaus. And then they exit a rear door, which led to a ramp, which led to the gas truck. Once they entered that ramp, the corridor was completely closed, where they couldn't get out. And those same German soldiers, SS, that just moments ago were in the courtyard helping the elderly, helping young children off of the transport trucks as they arrived into Chelmno, now the facade completely faded, and their sole purpose, the Germans, was just to, get those people into the gas truck as quickly as possible. Obviously, the Jews, by the time they saw the truck, they reacted and tried to fight their way out. But obviously, they had no chance, and they were all shoved into the truck. Hard to imagine. And the Germans would just close the doors, lock it with the padlock, connect the pipe from the engine, and that's how they would murder all the Jews within minutes, 10, 12, 15 minutes sometimes it took.
Since we have a very short time for this interview, I want to get ahead to the information that was smuggled out, and it was put on the BBC radio in June 26, 1941, and nothing happened, right?
I wouldn't say nothing happened. I wouldn't phrase it like that. Uh, a lot happened. So first of all, this escape, obviously, I think it was a
Oh, beyond.
heroic act because the people who did it knew that their families were gone. Almost all of them, at least.
Right.
But they did it not for themselves. They did it for others, right? They wanted to tell their people, the nearby villages, and tell the world. The machine of deception was so crucial to the Nazis to maintain, these horrific acts of mass murder that even the Jews in the nearby villages, a few kilometers away, had no idea of what was happening at Kulmhof, at Chelmno, at the what was called the transit center, right? So the purpose was to tell the world. It took months, as you say, and as I show at the end of the film, from when the escape occurred until that testimony was finally smuggled by way of Swedes all the way to the underground and the Polish government in exile in London. And that's where the BBC were the first to report it, which is considered the first news report of the Holocaust. And then the Daily Telegraph was the first appearance in print. And then it took about a week until it arrived to the US, where it was published in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, the LA Times. But here in the US, it was, a paragraph, usually at the end of the paper. In fact, the only paper that I know of that published it on its front page was an African-American newspaper called the Pittsburgh Courier. And that was published on the front page, the news of the extermination of the Jews in occupied Europe. And I think even their quoted sentence was, the Nazis can teach even the Southern whites a few lessons. I read that. Yeah. So I wouldn't say that nothing happened. the reaction of the world to the news was not as I think um, the people anticipated, but it did lead to the news. The news did not get out prior to that, prior to this story, prior to Salman Wiener and Micha Potchemnik escaping. And it took another few months after that. I think the date is December 19th, 1942, when the US, the UK, and a number of other governments, I think 10 other governments, made an official declaration that Germany is attempting to annihilate the Jewish people and something must be done. So by now, the world knew, number one, the world, but then also don't forget the effect it had within occupied Europe, where people in the Warsaw, Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto now knew what was happening. Solomon Wiener made his way after the escape and after the events of the film to Warsaw, where he was interviewed for the Ringelblum archive.
Yes.
Okay, if your
Yes.
viewers don't know what that is, they should definitely look it up. And he was interviewed by somebody there, and the word started getting out. So acts of resistance started happening. I think when I was growing up, there was this notion of sheeps to the slaughter, right?
Right.
And now we know that that is not the case. There were acts of resistance in almost every camp that we know of, There were definitely acts of resistance that we probably don't know, right? Because just like a lot of people escaped Chelmno that we don't know because they were captured and brought back or captured either by the Poles or by the Polish police or by the Germans. There were acts of resistance in every single camp, every single concentration camp, and almost every single ghetto. So I think if Salman and Michal had not escaped, had not provided this testimony, perhaps these acts of resistance, these revolts, these prisoner uprisings in camps such as Treblinka, Sobibor, the Sonderkommando in Auschwitz, obviously,
Right.
might not have happened.
I stand corrected, and when I say nothing happened, I did not mean that nothing happened on the side of the Jews. I mean on the side of the world. Yes, I 100% agree with you that they did exactly what they wanted to do, which was that story about Mr. Bernstein wanting not to be left behind. He wanted to get
Right.
on the truck. And when
That's true.
it says, at least maybe now he'll know, a different Mr. Bernstein will know not to get on the truck. So
Right.
I think very, very important information. And I'm very surprised that no one ever noticed this. I think it's wonderful that you did. So I would just want to say, encourage everyone to see this film, to share it, on social media, etc. It's really good. I mean, I will say it can be a little hard to watch sometimes, but it's very compelling. And it's very important that people know, especially today. I'm not political, just saying that Jews do resist. They have resisted and they will resist. So I thank you so much for being on the show. As I end so again, the name of the movie is The World Will Tremble. That's the concept that when the news gets out, the world will tremble. That's where that title comes from. It's said in the dialogue of the near the end of the film. I thank Leora, and I say, as I do at the end of every one of these podcasts, may the memory of the murdered victims and those who tried to save them be a blessing forever.